It's now my pleasure to welcome our next speaker. Pooja Shah is head of product at Protocol Labs and a member of the network funding team at Protocol Labs. In this talk, Pooja will explore different models and experiments to support the incentivization of ongoing maintenance, as well as new models we may consider as we enter a more open protocol-native future. Welcome, Pooja.
Hello, thank you so much. As was mentioned, my name is Pooja, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about some ideas when we think about the problem of incentivizing ongoing maintenance of existing projects. So I wanted to start first by setting up the problem a little bit. Why is this something that we should care about, especially in the public goods funding world? And I just wanted to start with sort of this disclaimer that incentivizing maintenance is a huge question, and there are many people who've spent many years thinking about this problem in a lot of detail and a lot of the nuances surrounding this problem as well. If you're interested in a much deeper survey of the various facets of maintenance as a general problem, I would definitely recommend you check out this book called Working in Public by Nadia, who actually used to be a Protocol Labs researcher. It's a really excellent book. But specifically, the problem that I'm interested in exploring today is starting with scoping it down a bit by thinking about projects that have already gone through sort of this initial phase of development. So I was thinking of this as kind of, there was some reason why a set of people decided to go through this 0 to 1 development phase for a particular project, which was creating the project in the first place. Either it's, they saw a need for something that they were really excited to go and solve, or maybe they were paid to do it as part of their jobs, or, received a grant to work on a project. There could have been a number of incentives to start someone down this path. But once that 0 to 1 development phase was completed, how do we continue to incentivize these initial creators or a broader community of contributors to take over maintenance and stewardship and ultimately growth of these projects longer term? So scoping it again a little bit, I wanted to start with some assumptions about the types of projects that we're talking about in this case. So these are projects that we can assume have an existing community of contributors, either, as I mentioned, the original creators or other contributors that are interested in the project. We could assume that there is an existing set of funders that are interested in providing ongoing financial support for the maintenance and stewardship of these projects. And obviously, this is not always the case in open source, but for a number of the types of projects that we're discussing, especially within Web3, this is often a reasonable assumption to be making, especially when we're talking about layer 1 protocols and so on. And then we're also talking about really this idea of public goods or commons type of projects where there isn't really a clear self-sustaining incentive model for ongoing maintenance. Obviously, when we're talking about startups or other sorts of businesses where someone can expect a revenue model down the road, there is this kind of natural incentive to just continue making the project better and better over time for this expectation of future reward. And in the types of projects that we're talking about here, we just remove that and say that in these projects, that isn't the case. So today, my goal really is to share some interesting experiments that I've seen in our space and really just sharing some ideas for inspiration. I don't think a wonderful solution exists here yet, or at least I haven't seen one yet. And I think that's why a lot of us are here talking about these ideas. So really the intent is to share a number of ideas so that we can collaborate and brainstorm better solutions to this problem. So first, before I dive into some of these examples of interesting ideas and solutions, just wanted to take a beat to define what do we really mean when we talk about maintenance. And there's a great quote from Nadia's book, which basically defines maintainers as those who are responsible for the future of a project's repository or set of repositories, and whose decisions affect the project laterally across a number of different areas. They can be thought of as stewards of the code. Typical activities that a maintainer might engage in look like prioritizing new directions for a project, whether it is maybe a particular bug that needs to be fixed or a new feature or user segment to go after. Obviously, it involves often writing code, pushing commits to the code base, reviewing PRs, and responding to and triaging issues from other folks in the community. This chart on this slide is sort of describes as the number of contributors in a community grows, how the types of activity that are happening within that community change as well. And it's kind of really interesting to see when the set of maintainers or core contributors is very small, a bulk of the activity is really focused on creation, developing new code. And as the contributor count grows and the community grows quite significantly, a lot more of the activities are around things like, maintenance and just coordinating people within that ecosystem, and much less about actually just, writing new features for the project. So this is, when we think about why is this subset of the problem that we're talking about kind of tricky, it really is like, we're not talking about funding open source development in general. This really is the problem of ongoing maintenance. And there's a quote again from Nadia's book, from someone that she interviewed, who mentions that the creation of a project is an intrinsically motivating thing. A lot of folks love building new ideas and seeing them come to life. But the actual ongoing maintenance is something that can be less intrinsically pleasurable for builders. And so that's the sort of thing that actually does require extrinsic motivation often. And it's very interesting to see, that even in Web3, where there is abundant capital for all sorts of different kinds of development efforts, and open source is very highly valued and very highly compensated, especially compared to other industries, there still is this kind of interesting perception that there are types of projects that are just less lucrative to work on. Like folks who are, core protocol developers could maybe be making a lot more money working on that next DeFi protocol or NFT marketplace or whatever it is. In general, it still is, even in Web3, kind of this need to think about what are the incentives for ongoing maintenance for projects that don't really have this very clear self-sustaining funding model for that type of maintenance work. So when we think about the goals of the solution that we want to design in this space, we're looking to design solutions that incentivize ongoing stewardship of existing projects that don't have sort of this innate self-sustaining incentive model. And some of the goals that we should, I think, try to keep in mind as we're thinking about designing solutions in this space include that we want to make sure that we're motivating this maintenance and stewardship behavior over sufficiently long timescales. It should feel like, while someone has skin in the game, while they're engaged and maintaining a particular project, they feel like there is this continuous motivation and incentive to do the work that they're doing. And it isn't as discrete or granular, which is kind of interesting looking at some of the experiments that I'll talk about next. It should feel really lucrative. It should be the case that the rewards for doing this sort of work should reflect the actual impact that is created by this sort of work. And I think this is just sort of a classic question when it comes to incentivizing open source development work in general. And you sort of see that reflected in the perception that I mentioned that, protocol development is potentially less lucrative than application development on top of layer 1 protocols or so on. But there is this sense, even within, I think, Web3, that some of the value that's being created by folks within the space is not being properly captured. And so we definitely want to close that gap a little bit, at least, and it should feel like a lucrative thing to be able to continue working on these projects and protocols and making them better. And then, of course, there are lots of things that are changing constantly as we think about this design space. And so whatever solutions are designed here should accommodate for volatility in currency values or all sorts of other things, changing membership of who counts as a maintainer or contributor or not, and who's a funder or not for a particular project, and other types of unforeseen circumstances as well. Just like a lot of other solutions that we tried to design in Web3, some guiding principles include the flexibility, mentioned this a little bit before, but just, there are all sorts of unforeseen things that may arise, and we want our solutions to be flexible to certain types of foreseeable things that could go wrong. We want them to be forkable so that they can, we can take the best ideas and modify them into new projects. Should be open to participation from funders and maintainers across a number of different projects and ecosystems, and should just be generally open and permissionless, and should be composable so that there really are just so many interesting experiments that are happening in the space that are solving different parts of the problem. And so being able to kind of stack these examples together and see what behavior emerges is something that I think we should try to keep in mind so that we can get the best possible solution holistically. All right, so taking a look at some very interesting experiments, in my opinion, some very interesting experiments. I wanted to start by looking at these examples of different projects, which I think collectively we can think of as streams. So some of the examples here are Radicle Drips, the Ethereum OpenGrants project, and then also Mirror has a new feature called Splits, or it's maybe a couple of years old at this point, I'm not sure, but a number of different projects which kind of look similar in the general shape of the solution, which is there's an existing pool of funding, and these contracts basically exist to direct that existing pool to many, splitting that existing pool between many contributors that deserve some share of that existing pot. And this type of solution is generally solving for the ability to share the credit or profits from a particular work with the teammates that contributed to the project. And it's funding individuals instead of teams or projects holistically. But some of the challenges with streams look like, when thinking about sort of this idea of wanting to motivate maintenance behavior on an ongoing basis, streams tend to be like discrete payments. Either they are one-time streams. So, you sell an NFT and then split in the mirror case, split the proceeds of that NFT sale among a number of different contributors according to some percentage basis. And that is kind of like a one-time payment. Even in some of these projects allow you to sort of have like an ongoing stream, but it still is like, like a monthly stream or something like that. And they tend to not have vesting components incorporated. So it's a little bit less like, folks who are contributing to these projects have less skin in the game in a sense. And so I think that's like one of the core challenges when we think about solutions that will do really well to solve this problem of incentivizing ongoing maintenance, vesting, and ongoing rewards that feel more continuous as opposed to discrete is the hypothesis is that's going to be really important to design a good solution here. Another set of projects, which I think are also very interesting and related to stream projects, but kind of a subset of the problem of streams overall, is just being able to assess the relative contributions and impact of a bunch of different contributors to a project. And two examples in this space are SourceCred and Coordinape. They take really different approaches, but are kind of trying to solve a similar problem. And again, it's related to just being able to solve for wanting to share ultimately a funding pool amongst a set of teammates that are individuals and not necessarily teams. So I think some of the challenges, obviously SourceCred and Coordinape are very, very clever projects, really interesting, and have contributed a lot, I think, from a thought leadership perspective to this space. But I think some of the challenges are that it's really difficult in both of these cases. What the results of this credit attribution process looks like is a contribution graph that weights the relative impacts and contributions of a number of different contributors. But in both cases, although the approaches are very different, it's pretty high overhead still to create this sort of contribution graph. And there are some limitations in the approaches that each of these projects currently takes. So in the SourceCred case, setting up a SourceCred instance on a project can be like a pretty technical thing, which not all communities feel fully equipped to do, which is an element of overhead. But then even once you have it set up, SourceCred takes a more algorithmic approach, looking at a number of different data inputs in order to ultimately create this algorithmic contribution graph. And the quality of that contribution graph is really just as good as the quality of those data inputs. And it can be the case in some cases where just like a human who is applying judgment to the scenario with a sufficiently small community that they can hold in their heads might be able to do a better job than an algorithm at actually assessing who was the most impactful contributor in a community. So that's kind of on the SourceCred side, and also looking at Coordinape, which takes the opposite approach, really valuing human judgment and trying to crowdsource human judgment and human inputs amongst a broader community of contributors, all the contributors who are eligible for earning rewards in a particular giving circle, for example. It still can be like a high overhead activity, especially as communities scale. So just imagine going through the exercise of assessing the relative impact of 100 contributors within a community. That's, or 1,000 folks. And so when we think about these contribution graphs that become very, very big, there's only so much that human input is really going to make sense. And then it starts to become potentially much more biased, lots more like local equilibria, but a less accurate global view of the relative contributions of folks in that community. So I think really interesting experiments, but there's definitely still more to explore, I think, here. And then, of course, in public goods funding, we have a lot of really interesting experiments around this idea of quadratic voting. And these sorts of projects I think are really interesting, solving for, in this case, funding projects often instead of individuals. And they are trying to introduce, in most of the experiments that at least I've seen, introduce this notion of human judgment. So there is a trusted community that's kind of like a set of experts within a particular space that are ultimately casting their judgment on what they think are the most impactful projects. Some of the challenges with quadratic voting type public goods funding experiments are, I'll also maybe start with the last one here first. I think this is interesting, but these types of funding experiments are generally done retroactively, and the funding amounts that will be given to each particular project is unpredictable. So when we think about like motivating behavior, incentivizing, in this case, ongoing maintenance, it does sort of lead to this question of how powerful of an incentive is retroactive, unpredictable funding for certain types of behavior. Obviously, it's a really nice bonus that I'm sure no team would turn down, but is it actually a really powerful incentive for folks to want to upfront put in that investment, not knowing down the road how much funding they will actually get for the effort that they put in? So there may be some limitation on how complete of a solution this could be, especially if it administered retroactively. I think, I'll just go bottoms up. So the other interesting challenge here too is, especially when we looked at sort of the results of the Optimism RetroPGF experiment, it was really interesting to see that the actual, like the variance in funding outcomes for different projects was very low. In absolute terms, like, the projects differed in it is all in basically the tens of thousands of dollars for every project, even the most impactful one, and the least impactful one that was still determined to be impactful enough to earn some funding. So it's possible that, these sorts of experiments may normalize a little bit too much and not be able to recognize the asymmetric impact that some projects may have. And that's something to solve for, I think, in these designs. It also can be, just from a tooling perspective, I think, folks are still iterating on this. There's a lot of really great progress that's been made here, but can still be pretty high overhead to actually administer a quadratic voting round. And then again, this is actually something interesting I learned from Vitalik's review on this experiment. But the actual set of voters here is a really significant input into not only the overall funding outcomes, but also which teams ultimately get selected, which teams of the set of teams that were nominated, which teams are actually eligible for funding down the road. And so, it could be that what the example that was given was that, comparing the top projects in the Optimism experiment versus the result of the most recent Gitcoin quadratic funding round at the time had basically no overlap. And part of that had to do with just the set of folks who were actually voting on these projects, and the set being very different. And then the last quick example that I'll mention here is this idea of multi-sig vesting contracts, which I think are probably the most sophisticated of the experiments that I'm mentioning in this talk, and definitely very, very interesting. These generally look like smart contracts that have a funding pool and ultimately are finding some way to vest that funding pool to a set of members. The funding pool can grow over time. Sometimes I think in the Mullick DAO, the Mullick V2 case, the funding pool can shrink as well if folks decide to rage quit, but generally, the funding pool is growing. And the set of members who are eligible for being awarded payments from this funding pool can also change over time based on their changing contributions. And these contracts do tend to also support multiple different assets, and not just one particular asset. So it's, what are these types of projects trying to solve for? So generally, this is trying to be a little bit more less retroactive, focused a little bit more on forward-looking funding, or some estimate, contributors within this structure should be able to have some estimates on what type of funding they may be able to expect from this contract over time. It also funds individuals, not just projects or teams. Because it's a contract, doesn't require any sort of intermediary institution to administer any voting process or anything else. And because it does support funding with multiple assets, it can expose participants to asymmetric upside via, just whatever the basket of tokens is that's being distributed, but it can include application tokens in addition to other things like stablecoins or ETH or whatever else. So I think this is a really promising direction. I think one of the challenges here is just really getting the weighting function right for all of these methods is really challenging. And that's what, Coordinape and SourceCred and other projects are trying to solve. But really understanding the relative contribution of different teammates is still one of the hardest problems here, I think, and is not solved for with this particular structure, but maybe could be solved for with other experiments. Okay, so it's kind of like an overview of some of the problem and solution constraints, some interesting experiments here. This next part of the talk, I wanted to just surface some ideas, and these aren't fully formed solutions at all, but really just some ideas that we might be able to combine with some of these other experiments, or take in wholly new directions in order to really solve this problem of incentivizing ongoing maintenance. So some of the, when thinking about some of these new directions, some of the requirements that we tried to keep in mind are, being able to expose maintainers and workers to asymmetric upside from the work that they're doing. So if they're doing a really, really amazing high impact job, they should be rewarded asymmetrically and should capture some of the value that they're creating. These incentives should be ongoing. So this idea of continuous vesting incentives as opposed to more discrete payments, and also being able to consider time delays in changes of things like waiting functions and things like that, so that we can a little bit reduce the shock to the system, and that can also actually help with making people feel a little bit safer and protected within these types of protocols too. So considering time delays. Taking into consideration different financial preferences for maintainers, just based on what is their risk tolerance and what are how would they like their particular basket of rewards to be constructed. In general, this idea that maybe we should think about not just vesting, but also staking, because maybe one of the mechanisms we can use here is having maintainers also have some skin in the game for the projects that they're working on. And then, of course, as mentioned before, just flexibility. So one of the ideas that some folks at Protocol Labs have been noodling on a little bit is this idea of maintenance-specific multisigs, or DAOs. And just to sketch out the shape of the solution a little bit, this could look like a one-click deploy contract or multisig that can be attached to a specific GitHub repo or organization that can enable the organization maintainers or repo maintainers to accept donations of various different assets, and that ultimately get sent directly to the multisig wallet. This definitely would, there are still important questions around how to govern the funds that are sequestered within the multisig and so on, which are a little bit out of scope. But being able to, tie this structure to maybe some of the streaming mechanisms that were mentioned before, or something like the Protocol Guild example of the AstroDrop contract, to be able to just continually allocate funds to whoever the multisig signers decide should be part of the membership of contributors that are recipients of this stream. But just this is a little bit more solving for really great UX around spinning up funding pools for particular projects, having this be based on projects, which allows the ability to estimate, to fund based on the impact of a particular project, as opposed to just putting all the money into one pool and it gets directed to individuals. So it's a little bit maybe more impact based in that sense, and also is kind of a composable structure that can interact with some of the other mechanisms we've described. This other idea is, also I think really interesting, and also maybe a component that could be combined with some of the other mechanisms here. And I want to give a hat tip to Evan, who's helping to organize this conference, because this idea really came from him. But it was just this, coming from this idea that one of the things that makes a great steward or maintainer for a project is someone who does a really great job at valuing and making predictions about what's going to be valuable to work on in a project. And again, this could be, a really critical bug that's going to be really important to address, or a new feature or direction for the project to take. And one direction here could be looking into other examples that do a good job of valuing great forecasting abilities, such as prediction markets, and rewarding this ability to make really great predictions that end up coming true in some way. So I think the interesting connection that Evan made between this idea of being able to make great predictions and that being a core element of great stewardship is something that's really interesting and may factor into how we design systems to incentivize great stewardship and maintenance. And then the last sort of little nugget to consider is how might we leverage staking mechanisms when thinking about this problem of ongoing maintenance incentivization. So one maybe example could be thinking of some sort of unit that represents an individual's capacity or a team's capacity to work in certain areas. And there's a cap on the number of units that each individual gets based on something. And individuals, when they're working on particular projects, maybe have the ability to stake their capacity on that project. And there is a funding pool, which is, allocated is determined in some other way. But ultimately, how the rewards are vested and distributed to individuals over time is based on, maybe to some extent, on how much skin they have in the game, how much they have staked to a particular project. And of course, also on the actual demonstration of the work they do and the quality of that work as well, which could be another input into the system. But the longer and the more that individuals are staking their work units to a particular project, the rewards could scale in some mechanism as well to sort of achieve this effect of incentivizing longer term maintenance and commitment to projects as well. I think there's just a lot of different ideas in this space. I think there's a lot to explore and discover together. We created a Discord channel for folks who are interested in talking about some of these ideas and would love to direct folks either directly to this particular channel or to the Funding the Commons space where we can explore some of this in more detail. But I think it's a really important problem to solve, and I'm really excited to get to work on this with all the folks in this amazing community. Thank you.